So, one of the biggest topics that we cover in the course is China. And while it's important to know why the modern day China, the CCP, is the way it is important to bring things back to the Cultural Revolution, the revolution that would eventually create the Communist Party that rules over China today. It's a very complex, long, and fascinating history that combines the war in the Pacific, the Opium Wars, leftover European imperialism, America, and the changing times. So let's get started. By the way, does anyone actually know who was in that portrait in the previous slide? It was Mao Zedong. So when we're looking at China, it's good to begin with the geography to understand the basic geographical understanding of the country. And in short, actually, China is a rather large geographic area for the country. Um, and essentially, there are three different, geographical areas in China. There is essentially the river lowlands, which is where the Han Chinese and where the vast majority of the population and political power exists in China. Highland China, the mountains and the Himalayas, Tibet, and then arid China, which is the dry. There's also the Yangtze and Yellow River, which were the cradles for the civilization of China to begin. China also only has one major water access, which is along the Pacific Ocean, along the South China Sea or the Korean Sea. To the north is Russia. West gets into Central Asia with the steppes and more dry conditions, and then to the very, very south is Southeast Asia with a lot more tropics. When you think about the history of China, you need to also think about it in the dynastic cycle. There actually have been quite a few different historical time periods in China, as China is one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. But for thousands of years, China had been ruled by dynasties, and each dynasty, which really in itself means a civilization, each dynasty has achieved the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is the concept that the dragon emperor, the emperor, has like this divine right to rule because they believe they were the center of everything, and anyone else who was outside of the emperor's realm, the dragon emperor, was viewed as barbarian. And the dynasties and the dynastic cycle always has this, the cycle, beginning the mandate, achieving the mandate, losing the mandate of heaven, falling into a civil war until someone else is able to reclaim a new mandate from heaven after an armed rebellion and considerable time of bloodshed. It basically, new dynasty gains power, restores peace and order, claims it a mandate. Strong dynasty establishes peace and prosperity, viewed to have a mandate of heaven. Then the dynasty begins to decline, becomes bankrupt or corrupt, taxes are raised, power grows weaker, disasters such as a flood, famine, or peasant revolt or invasion will weaken the mandate even more. Then the old dynasty is then viewed of having lost the mandate of heaven, which means then the dynasty has been overthrown, and a series of rebellions and civil wars and battles, basically time of considerable bloodshed, happens until a new mandate is established, and then then the cycle gets repeated all over again. Interesting to note, though, also in the 1750s, China was the world's leading manufacturer in metal-made goods. And 1750 is an interesting date because it was in 1750 when the Industrial Revolution began to organically start in England. And even though England was and has been viewed as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the triumph of steam power, because the English has such vast quantities of coal and iron, those two natural raw materials, they needed to for industrialized society. But despite that, though, in 1750, China was actually producing more goods in America or India or any of those European powers that had, like Britain, France, Spain, etc., that had been establishing their empires throughout North America, South America, Asia, Africa. And then, as I was saying, one thing to remember is from a Chinese point of view, they always viewed themselves as the center, right? That's why they had the idea of the mandate of heaven, how built the wall of China. They viewed everyone who was beyond their borders as being barbaric, um, uncivilized, and whatever anyone else were trying to offer, the emperor just didn't really see much value to it because they felt they had everything that was needed. Even though there actually was various imperial tendencies and attitudes towards other people around them, it was still was the case. Now, with the British, uh, as we looked at with the British Empire, especially with the Opium War, the British did want to trade with the various dynasties, but the British really didn't care what dynasty it was. All they cared was getting the best deal. But the British definitely were not above meddling and interfering with whatever governments that were there so they can get the best deal. As an example, at the Treaty of Nanking, the emperor, Chinese emperor, the Dragon Emperor, and actually it's kind of, as a little side note, interesting point. Dragons, if you ever look at the paintings or drawing, a typical dragon would have 3 claws on its feet, or paws, 3 of them. But if a dragon had 4 claws, that was a dragon that's associated with the emperor, hence the term Dragon Emperor. By the Treaty of Nanking, it gave all the power of trade to the foreign influence. It weakened the mandate. The Treaty of Nanking also was a treaty made by the British, and the empire felt it was forced to sign, the empire being China had to sign this treaty because of what had happened at the Opium War and the growing influence, and the treaty must be under British law. Everything that would be part of it would be under British law. And so Hong Kong was given over to Great Britain. Hong Kong was a rather, was a small fishing town, really, but it would be transformed into the mega city. This map shows the various influence and spheres of zones that were influenced by foreign powers over the traditional area for the Chinese. It essentially was Japanese, French, British, and Russian there, along with some from India and also Southeast Asia. But this was from 1850 to 1910, so before the First World War. But this would be part of the beginning of what the Communist Party of China refers to as a century of humiliation. Now, the Boxer Rebellion was a rebellion that was done by the peasants, which could also indicate the ending of the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle. But those peasants who are displaced workers, and they wanted to create a society of the glorious, harmonious fist. Their main goal was to get rid of the foreign influence, the imperial powers that I mentioned before. During the Qin dynasty, which is the Manchurian ethnic group, it was foreign to the Mongols, and therefore they wanted to get rid of them, and instead then to restore the Ming dynasty because that was where the Han Chinese, the Han are the mainland Chinese, where their ethnicity or group had originated from. Now, Sun Yat-sen is a very important figure in the history of China. Sun Yat-sen founded the Kuomintang, the KMT, which is basically the Nationalist Party. And Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Qing dynasty. He established the Republic of China. He became the president of the Chinese Republic. Sun Yat-sen was pro-democracy, pro-republic-style government, so like the United States, and was very sympathetic and pro-Western ideas. But even though he was interested and sympathetic towards Western ideas of government, liberty, and democracy, he wanted China to maintain its own independence and China's own sovereignty. Sun Yat-sen basically had three principles that he enshrined into the KMT, the Kuomintang. First was the principle of Manquan, which is the people have the sovereign power, i.e. democracy. The second principle is Manzui, nationalism, the ending of foreign imperialism in China, going back to those foreign influences, especially also the Opium Wars. And then third was the principle of Manxin, which was a collection of various social reforms, which include economic development, industrialization, modernization, technology, social welfare. And this was all because China was very far behind in technology that the West now possessed. And he did this, and essentially these three principles collected together, so China could once again compete as an equal partner on the world stage. So even though Sun Yat-sen does have a little bit of a more positive view and the quote-unquote Western world, though, and he did believe in like sovereignty of the people and democracy and those ideas. There was some definite weakness of the KMT. One is actually a really big one, is the disunity of China. And there essentially were, with the disunity of China, there was two main problems. First was the local warlords who fought the Kuomintang for control. And these warlords who think that the disunity within the mainland China will help them gain power. Once again, think about the whole mandate of heaven belief, the thought that China was the center of the world, and the whole dynastic cycle. Warlords, conflict, considerable bloodshed was part of it. And second was wars being waged in China from 1912 to 1928. And these are the wars between the communists and the nationalists. And those wars will then only stop in 1928 once Imperial Japan began expanding its borders. And this is, of course, after what happened in the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. Additionally, for the Kuomintang, other weakness was the infrastructure. Infrastructure was incredibly poor. At the start of the First World War, there was only about 6,000 miles of railway track, less than 10,000 kilometers. Whereas in the United States, there was 225,000 miles, 470,000 kilometers of track. And there was also very few good, accessible, intact roads. So transportation was a substantial issue in trying to maintain or even create a sense of unity in mainland China. However, in the Kuomintang, they did manage to achieve a balance of both sides. Now, this is a little bit of the political spectrum, the left and the right. Kuomintang might have been more in the center, but their policies was some on the right wing, which supported business people and politicians, but also was also on the left side of the political spectrum, which supported communists, intellectuals, radicals, and students. It tried to achieve a balance between both sides of the political spectrum. And the Kuomintang supported Sun Yat-sen. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek became commander-in-chief of the Kuomintang Army, and Chiang Kai-shek was able to defeat the various warlords across China and begin the process of unifying China. Think once again of the dynastic cycle. However, later on, the war would start with the Communist Party, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang would lose the war with the Communists. And the war was actually a civil war, with Chiang Kai representing the nationalists and Chairman Mao Zedong representing the communists. In 1923 and 33 to 37, war between communists and the nationalists. The war only stopped because of Japanese imperial aggression. After the First World War, which was from 1914 to 1980, there was a series of border conflicts between Imperial Japan and China. Though really at this point there was two Chinas. There was China that was nationalist, and then there was communist. While Imperial Japan invaded Manchuria, which was part of China until 1931, Japan set up Manchuria to be a puppet state called Manchukuo. And Japan did this because they needed the raw materials to feed their industries, as well as space for their large urban population. This map actually shows the height of the territory that Imperial Japan had. You might remember this from the War in the Pacific notes that we had looked at from a previous day. While Imperial Japan's expansion had gone rapidly, because of their growing rapid population, they had very few natural resources to support this rapid population. Additionally, Japan wanted an empire to support its population for land as well as materials, which was the reason why they invaded Manchuria in 1931. 6 years later, Imperial Japan would invade the mainland China itself. For the Long March, Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader, would gain support in the communist fight. The communists, or Chiang Kai-shek, wanted to eliminate the communists, and the communists marched out of the city to the farmland. During the Long March, for the communists, 100,000 would start, but only 8,000, according to records, survived the Long March. It was a long way, as the name would imply. If you look at this map, you can see the actual direction of the march itself. The rape of Nanking brought the nationalists and the communists together. They had a common enemy, which was Imperial Japan, as these propaganda posters and images have shown. In 1937, for July, Japan took over North China and was moving towards Beijing. Japan's army was modern and was mainly victorious, and they had taken over the city of Nanking, where over 300,000 people would die. This is the Nanking Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking. This is an event which is still unresolved between these two countries today, and is something that the communist government will often mention. The Rape of Nanking was the war between China and Japan, and eventually will result in millions of deaths, which indirectly will lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Japan took over Nanjing and killed 250,000 people in a 3-week period. There was still a civil war, though, between the nationalists and the communists, even though they shared a common enemy, which was Japan, and at times actually fought together against their common enemy. But the communist nationals resumed war after they finished fighting with Japan, and the communists would be victorious in 1949. After Chiang Kai-shek was defeated, the nationalists would flee to Formosa, the island nation of Taiwan. There's much speculation and debate why Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists would lose the war against the communists, as they had the army and the materials and the supplies, as well as foreign government support. But it was the nationalists who did a large majority, but not exclusively, but a large majority of the fighting against Imperial Japan, while the communists stayed in the interior and had fewer engagements. It could be argued that the communists were less damaged or harmed or war exhausted by the time Japan had surrendered. And so once the civil war between the communists and nationalists had started once again, the communists were fresh and ready to fight, where that would not be the case for the nationalists. But the communists would be victorious. You may want to check this one on what had happened for the March of Democracy, or the March for Communism. But for many Kuomintang's people, though, the former leaders or members of the Kuomintang, while the party was not defeated, they did convert to communism. Manchuria, that was once Manchukuo, taken over by Japan, was taken over by communists in 1948. By 1949, the communists had complete control in Manchuria, which led to Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists fleeing to Taiwan to set up basically a government in exile and prepare the next stage of the fight. While the nationalists had fled to Taiwan, the communists gained control over the entire mainland of China. They had also taken over Turkestan, Shanjin, Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, and Tibet, expanding the borders of the territory controlled by the People's Republic of China. And this is where the names get a little confusing. There are, after the war, two Chinas. There's the People's Republic of China, Beijing, the communists who won the war, and then there's the Republic of China, the nationalists, the one led by Chiang Kai-shek, who were in Taiwan and set up a new capital in Taipei. Both of these people or governments claim to be in China, but today it is the communists who do get most of the attention because of their global population and other reasons that are mixed in. It should also be noted that both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong both consider themselves to be students, pupils of the teachings of Sun Yat-sen. But even though they were pupils of both those teachings of Sun Yat-sen, from what we've seen, they have had two different ways to interpret Sun Yat-sen's thoughts. And while the Communist government was on the mainland of China, Chairman Mao Zedong became chairman of the Communist Party and then leader of China from 1949 to 1976. And during this time, there will be substantial political changes under Mao, starting with the first five-year plan from 1953 to 57. During the first five-year plan, there was advances in agricultural, coal, electricity, iron, and steel production, the fundamental building blocks for an industrialized society. In the second five-year plan from 1958 to 62 was also referred to as a quote-unquote Great Leap Forward. And during this so-called Great Leap Forward, China became a leader in the leading industrial country. Peasants were organized into communes. However, despite these successes, there was widespread catastrophe. A famine of at least 14 to 40 million people would die because of the famine. But this was not recorded because Mao wanted to only tell everyone about the glories and the successes of communism. He did not want to mention the failures of it. And only the glories and successes were wherever were recorded. It got so bad at times to meet the quotas, pots and pans would be melted down to meet the metal quota. Nothing to cook or farm with, lie down for meat demands, sold off food, people were uneducated, the harvest is bad, and students in China were not taught any of this history of the Great Leap Forward. They were just told about the China becoming like this industrialized country and how people are living in this communist paradise and communes, but they never actually mentioned about the actual price, the death toll that would be brought from this. It is quite shocking, really. But then after the Great Leap Forward came the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And anything that is anti-communist or anti-Mao was completely destroyed. If you're educated, you're killed. A Buddhist, you're killed. Pro-dynasty cycle, the whole dynastic cycle, mandate of heaven ideas, you're killed. You own your own books, you're killed. You hated Mao, you were killed. This was an effort to revive the interest of Mao's idea and for Mao to regain his power after the failed Great Leap Forward. But Mao was claimed that the reactionary elements were taking over the party, and he called for youths to engage in post-revolutionary war-class warfare, which resulted in the creation of like these Red Guards who would march throughout China, and other reactionaries who were moved from positions of power. It is whitewashing. It is trying to designate what is actually rewrite was actually going on there in the great proletarian cultural revolution. Mao was definitely taking on that more of a serious side of both Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx of what needs to be done for a true communist society, the workers' society, workers' paradise, proletariat to actually occur, which is through violence there. But in the proletariat revolution, there was a slogan: get rid of the four olds. The four olds, which was old customs, old traditions, old habits, old ideas. All these old ideas must be destroyed in this new revolution that Mao was doing. And with the Red Guards, teenagers who had been indoctrinated now believe they've been inspired to carry out this great change. These youth were, however, completely manipulated by the adults, but they were a force of people who believed in Chairman Mao's teachings and what he was talking about. And the Red Guards started to fight each other because each guard group thought that they were a better Maoist. Essentially, these Red Guards kind of resulted in like street warfare, gang warfare, fiefdom stuff, just it's a competitive edge, which Mao was fine with. And to help to achieve more of this was Mao's Little Red Book. Now, the Communist Party is the core of the Chinese Revolution, and its principles were based on Marxism and Leninism. And the party criticism should be carried out within the party. You never criticize the party publicly, you just do it privately. Of course, Karl Marx or then Lenin with the Russian were some of the early founders or philosophers of the actual ideology of communism, Lenin being in the Russian, and then Marx going back to the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, the revolution with the Little Red Book and the recognition of class and class struggle are necessary for peasants and the Chinese people to overcome both domestic and foreign and enemy elements. This, however, is not simple, clean, or straightforward. War was a continuation of politics, and there are at least two types, or just, reasons for it. The just, which are the unjust wars. And while no one likes a just war, we must remain ready to wage war against imperialism agitations there. Never war for the sake of war, but war to protect, to protect. The war without end. There's really a lot of Orwell's writings. while at the same time a communist must be selfless with the interests of the masses at heart, and the communist must present largeness of mind by practical farsight. This is everything that Mao talked about in his Little Red Book. If once again you pause video explore, you can see a lot of propaganda elements that we studied early on in this course that is being shown in this poster. Also, with Mao's Little Red Book, fighting is unpleasant, and the people of China would prefer not to do it at all. At the same time, though, they stand ready to wage a just war for self-preservation against any reactionary elements, both foreign and domestic. And China's road to modernization will be built on the principles of diligence and frugality. Nor will it be legitimate to relax if 50 years later there'll be a mass modernization. And while women represent a great productive force in China, and equality among sexes is one of the goals of communism, the multiple burdens which women must bear must be also eased compared to the men. And then the last part is Tiananmen Square, where youth occupied it and sit down protest for democracy. They weren't against the government, they just want more democratic elements. 5,000 would die from this. The reason we know is because there was foreign journalists who were there to protect, but also document what was happening. And this is what happened at Tiananmen Square. Tank Man. And a warning into the future of what might be happening in border conflicts, because there are quite a few border conflicts with China and their surrounding neighbor countries today, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, Nepal, Japan, Russia, Mongolia, to name a few conflict or disputed zones.